I'm still trying to process how they managed to make me the villain in this entire story. I used every possible advantage in Vancouver's Shaughnessy Heights, played their own games better than they did, documented every dirty secret, and turned their network into my personal ladder. If I could do it all over again, honestly, I wouldn't change a thing. I need to get this off my chest. My name is Seraphine Ashworth, I'm 29, and for 3 years I was the most calculating social climber Vancouver has ever known. When I met Magnus Blackthorne at the Fairmont Hotel one rainy March evening, I already knew exactly who he was. Heir to Blackthorne Investments, a family with over $200 million in assets, entwined with every corner of British Columbia's elite. That meeting was no accident. I went hunting, and I found my target. 2 months of quiet research went into that first spontaneous encounter. I knew he liked to drink old fashions at the hotel bar every Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. I knew he was licking his wounds after ending a 5-year relationship, lonely and craving validation. I mapped out every detail in advance. When he brought up the headaches of corporate acquisitions, I asked sharp follow-up questions about asset valuation. If he complained about family pressure, I mirrored empathy, just enough to pull him in. And when a conversation drifted to tech investments, I referenced studies and articles I'd crammed the night before just to sound informed. Magnus, honestly, was never difficult prey. At 32, he needed his mother's approval before booking a holiday. Wealthy but weak, my ideal scenario. People like that, you can make them believe anything if you show them what they want to see. Our wedding was my masterpiece of social engineering. I had him proposing after 4 months just by playing my cards right, being supportive, never too eager, feigning indifference to money but careful with compliments. Inside, I was doing the math. How much control over the investment portfolios and how quickly could I set up access? The Queen Elizabeth Theatre ceremony cost nearly $500,000, and Victoria, my now mother-in-law, made sure I understood it was Blackthorne money, as if I was some gold-digging upstart, not a strategist working a 3-year plan. During our honeymoon in Whistler, I started systematically collecting every family secret Magnus dropped. Old pension funds embezzled by his father, Ophelia's insider trading, Victoria's offshore Caymans accounts. Each slip of the tongue was saved, encrypted, archived. Magnus thought he was showing intimacy. Really, he was just handing me ammo for when the game turned. I leveraged that family network at every function, especially those stuffy Thursday dinners at Capilano Golf Club. While Victoria introduced me as Magnus's business-savvy wife to her socialites, I was fishing for new consulting clients. Within 6 months, Ashworth Strategic had landed $2 million worth of contracts, all thanks to Blackthorne recommendations. The irony? Victoria loved to brag about me as the perfect daughter-in-law to her friends, not realizing I was collecting evidence on her and using every social event to land new deals. Have you ever planned someone's downfall while smiling across the table from them? Leave your answer in the comments, subscribe, and stick with me. Do you think leveraging the power and wealth of the elite is wrong, or is it simply intelligent? For 2 years they adored me, the well-mannered newcomer who stayed in her place, who played the family game, who made Magnus happy, all while I was 3 steps ahead, scripting the day their empire would fall. Building my position in Vancouver's elite circles required more than just charm. It demanded strategic patience and calculated vulnerability. Victoria Blackthorne loved feeling superior, so I gave her exactly what she craved: a daughter-in-law who appeared grateful for every crumb of acceptance. Those Thursday evening dinners at their Shaughnessy mansion became my masterclass in social manipulation. Victoria would seat me at the far end of the table, always making sure I understood my place in the hierarchy. Perfect. While she held court with her wine-soaked stories about charity galas and country club politics, I was mentally cataloging every name, every connection, every weakness she revealed. The key to infiltrating old money families is understanding their insecurities. Victoria desperately feared being seen as nouveau riche despite the Blackthorn fortune spanning 3 generations. She name-dropped constantly, wore her Cartier watches like armor, and panicked whenever someone questioned the family's social credentials. I exploited this beautifully. At dinner parties, I'd casually mention meeting someone from an even more established family, then watch Victoria's face tighten with anxiety. "Oh, you know the Pemberton Smythes? Their great-grandfather founded the Pacific Railway." I'd pause, letting her squirm, then add, "They spoke so highly of your charity work, Victoria. Said the Blackthorns were the backbone of Vancouver society." Magnus was pathetically easy to read. He craved his mother's approval so desperately that he'd agree with anything she said, even when it contradicted his own opinions from 5 minutes earlier. During family discussions about investments, I'd watch him parrot Victoria's conservative viewpoints, despite privately expressing more aggressive strategies to me later. This gave me tremendous leverage. In our bedroom, away from his mother's watchful eyes, Magnus would confess his real thoughts about expanding Blackthorn investments into tech startups and cryptocurrency. I'd listen, ask intelligent questions, make him feel like the brilliant businessman he imagined himself to be. Then I'd carefully guide these conversations toward opportunities that would benefit Ashworth Strategic. The beautiful irony was that Victoria actually helped me build my consulting business without realizing it. She'd introduce me to her friends as Magnus's ambitious little wife, always with that condescending tone that made other women want to prove her wrong by hiring me. Within 6 months, I had contracts with 3 of her closest friends' husbands, all of whom were struggling with failing restaurants or retail ventures. Richard Blackthorn had died 2 years before I met Magnus, but his shadow still dominated family conversations. Victoria spoke about him with reverent worship, constantly reminding everyone that he'd built the family fortune from nothing. What she didn't know was that I'd already researched Richard thoroughly, including the pension fund he'd diverted in the 1990s and the shell companies he'd used to avoid taxes. Every family dinner was an intelligence gathering, operation disguised as social pleasantries. I'd smile, nod, play the grateful outsider, all while building detailed mental files on everyone present. The real breakthrough came when I realized that Victoria's friends were just as insecure as she was, but about different things. Eleanor Pemberton worried constantly about her husband's gambling debts. Margaret Chen feared her son's drug addiction would surface in the society pages. Sarah Morrison, Daniel's mother, was desperate to hide her family's recent financial troubles behind designer clothes and expensive jewelry. These women shared their deepest secrets over afternoon tea at the Capilano Golf Club, treating gossip like currency. Victoria loved being the center of these sessions, and she'd bring me along as her pet project, the daughter-in-law she was civilizing for polite society. I played my role perfectly. Quiet, attentive, occasionally asking innocent questions that made them reveal even more. "Oh my, Eleanor, how do you manage the stress? I imagine Richard's business ventures keep you awake at night." She'd immediately spill everything about the mounting gambling losses and the second mortgage on their West Vancouver mansion. Within months, I had enough compromising information on Vancouver's social elite to fill a blackmail manual. But I was smarter than that. Instead of threats, I used strategic sympathy. Eleanor's husband needed business restructuring advice. Ashworth Strategic offered discreet consultation. Margaret's son required a legitimate job to satisfy his probation officer. I had connections with client companies looking for reformed employees. The beauty of this approach was that everyone felt grateful to me rather than threatened. I wasn't exploiting their weaknesses, I was solving their problems. They'd recommend my services to other desperate families, creating an expanding network of wealthy clients who owed me their reputations. Magnus remained completely oblivious to what was happening right under his nose. He saw these social events as tedious obligations, usually spending his time discussing golf handicaps with the husbands while I systematically documented every family secret shared by their wives. Ophelia proved particularly useful during this period. Unlike her mother, she wasn't naturally suspicious, and she genuinely seemed to enjoy having another woman around who wasn't constantly judging her life choices. She'd confide in me about her relationship struggles, her concerns about Daniel's business ventures, and her fears about never being good enough for the Blackthorn name. I cultivated this friendship carefully, positioning myself as her ally against Victoria's critical comments. "Your mother means well, but you're a grown woman making your own choices," I'd tell her during our private conversations. This made Ophelia feel understood and supported, which meant she shared even more sensitive information with me. Through Ophelia, I learned about the family's financial structure, including trust funds, investment portfolios, and the complex web of holding companies Richard had established. She'd mention these details casually, never realizing she was giving me insights into millions of dollars in hidden assets. The Thursday dinners became my weekly intelligence briefings. Victoria would discuss the family's charitable commitments, revealing which organizations received major donations and why. Magnus would complain about regulatory compliance issues at Blackthorn Investments, inadvertently describing exactly how the company's more questionable practices operated. By the end of my second year in the family, I had detailed knowledge of every major financial decision, every family feud, every hidden shame that the Blackthorns wanted to keep private, all while maintaining the perfect facade of the grateful, slightly naive daughter-in-law who was still learning the ways of Vancouver high society. The third year marked when I transitioned from information gathering to active exploitation. I'd spent 2 years building trust and mapping out every vulnerability. Now it was time to monetize that intelligence systematically. Victoria's charity work provided my first major opportunity. She served on the board of 3 different foundations, each managing multi-million-dollar budgets with surprisingly lax oversight. During one of our conversations, she mentioned how frustrated she was with their current financial advisor, who charged excessive fees while delivering mediocre returns. I positioned Ashworth Strategic as the solution, but not directly. Instead, I had one of my existing clients, a restaurant owner whose business I'd successfully restructured, casually mention my expertise to another board member at a social gathering. Within 2 weeks, I received a formal invitation to present investment strategies to the foundation boards. The presentation was my masterpiece of calculated manipulation. I demonstrated how their current advisor was underperforming market benchmarks while charging premium fees. Then I outlined a comprehensive restructuring plan that would reduce costs by 30% while improving returns through diversified portfolios and strategic reinvestment. Victoria was initially skeptical, worried about appearing to favor family members for professional contracts. But when the other board members enthusiastically endorsed my proposals, she had no choice but to support the decision. Suddenly, Ashworth Strategic was managing $8 million in foundation assets, earning substantial management fees while positioning me at the center of Vancouver's charitable establishment. Magnus watched this unfold with a mixture of pride and confusion. He was pleased that his wife was achieving professional success, but he couldn't quite understand how I'd managed to impress his mother's social circle so effectively. "You're really making a name for yourself," he'd say, as if my accomplishments were some happy accident, rather than the result of 3 years of strategic planning. The foundation contracts opened doors to private wealth management opportunities. Vancouver's elite families were notoriously conservative with their money, typically working with the same established firms their grandparents had used. But when they saw the returns I was generating for the charitable organizations, several began quietly inquiring about personal financial advice. I was selective about which clients to accept, focusing on families with the most influence and the darkest secrets. The Pemberton Smythes hired me to restructure their investments after Eleanor's husband's gambling debts forced them to liquidate several properties. The Chens brought me in to establish offshore accounts that would protect their assets if their son's legal troubles escalated. Each new client meant access to another wealthy family's private information, creating an expanding web of intelligence and leverage. I learned about tax evasion schemes, extramarital affairs, business partnerships built on fraud, and political connections maintained through illegal campaign contributions. Victoria began treating me differently during this period. Where she'd once been condescending, she now showed genuine respect for my professional accomplishments. She'd introduce me to new people as Magnus's brilliant wife rather than his ambitious little wife, and she started seeking my opinion on financial matters during family discussions. This shift in dynamics was intoxicating. The woman who'd spent 3 years making me feel like an outsider was now treating me as an equal, even deferring to my expertise in certain areas. Magnus noticed the change too, and it seemed to make him prouder of our marriage, as if my success reflected well on his judgment in choosing me. But the most satisfying aspect was watching how my growing influence affected the family's power structure. Victoria had always been the matriarch who controlled every major decision, but now she found herself consulting with me before making financial commitments or charitable pledges. I had successfully infiltrated Vancouver's elite society, built a multi-million-dollar business, and positioned myself as an indispensable advisor to some of the city's wealthiest families, all while maintaining the perfect image of a devoted wife who'd simply gotten lucky in business. Everything changed the morning I discovered that Victoria had been playing a game even longer than I had. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my home office when Magnus burst in, holding a manila folder with Victoria's distinctive handwriting on the label. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking slightly as he set it on my desk. "My mother asked me to give this to you," he said quietly. "She wants to meet with us tonight, both of us. She said it was time we discussed the real family business." Inside the folder were detailed financial records spanning 15 years, documenting transactions I'd never seen before despite my thorough research into Blackthorn Investments. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands, numbered Swiss bank accounts, and a complex network of international holdings that dwarfed anything I'd discovered during my investigations. But what made my blood run cold were the photographs tucked between the financial statements. Pictures of me taken over the past 3 years, entering client meetings, having lunch with potential targets, even private conversations I'd thought were completely confidential. Someone had been watching me just as carefully as I'd been watching them. The final document was a typewritten note in Victoria's precise handwriting. "Seraphine, dear, did you really think you were the first clever young woman to marry into this family with ambitious plans? We should talk." That evening, Victoria received us in Richard's old study, a room I'd never been invited to enter before. The walls were lined with leather-bound ledgers, and she sat behind his massive oak desk like a CEO conducting a board meeting. "Sit down, both of you," she said, her voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before. Gone was the wine-soaked socialite who gossiped about charity galas. This was a woman who'd been running complex financial operations for decades. She opened another folder and spread documents across the desk. "Seraphine, your research was impressive, but incomplete. Richard didn't just embezzle pension funds. He created an entirely separate financial empire that's been operating parallel to Blackthorn Investments since 1987. The foundation boards you've been working with? They're fronts for money laundering operations that process over $50 million annually." My mouth went dry as she continued. "The charitable donations, the offshore accounts, the shell companies, they're all part of a system Richard established to move money for some very powerful people. Politicians, business leaders, even some organized crime figures who needed their assets cleaned through legitimate channels." Magnus looked as stunned as I felt. "Mom, what are you saying? Are we criminals?" Victoria laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Darling boy, we're facilitators. We help people solve financial problems that traditional banking can't handle. It's been quite profitable for our family, and now it can be profitable for Seraphine's business as well." She turned to me with an expression that was equal parts admiration and warning. "I've been watching you build your network, collect information on our friends, and position yourself at the center of Vancouver's financial community. It's exactly what I would have done at your age. But now it's time to decide. Do you want to keep playing small-scale games with restaurant consultations, Or do you want to join the real family business? The room fell silent except for the ticking of Richard's grandfather clock. I realized that every move I'd made over the past 3 years had been anticipated, maybe even orchestrated, by a woman who'd been operating at a level I'd never imagined. Victoria wasn't just Magnus's controlling mother. She was the head of a criminal organization that had been using Vancouver's social elite as cover for international money laundering. And now she was offering me a partnership. Have you ever realized that someone you underestimated was actually 10 steps ahead of you the entire time? Tell me in the comments how you'd handle discovering that your biggest target was actually recruiting you. Would you walk away or double down on the game? I stared at Victoria across Richard's desk, processing the magnitude of what she'd just revealed. The woman I'd spent 3 years studying, categorizing as a shallow socialite obsessed with appearances, had been running a $50 million money laundering operation while I played amateur games with restaurant consultations. I need time to think about this, I said carefully. But Victoria shook her head. Time is a luxury we don't have, dear. The foundations you've been managing? They're already processing money for some very impatient clients. Walking away now would raise questions we can't afford to answer. Magnus looked between us like he was watching a tennis match in a language he didn't understand. Mom, are you saying Seraphine is already involved in whatever this is? Victoria's smile was razor sharp. Seraphine has been handling approximately $12 million in questionable funds over the past 18 months. The beautiful irony is that she's been laundering money so efficiently. Our clients specifically requested to work with her directly. My blood turned cold. Every foundation contract, every charitable investment, every restructuring project, I'd been unknowingly facilitating criminal activity while congratulating myself on my business acumen. Victoria hadn't just been watching me, she'd been using me. The Pemberton Smythe family's gambling debts? Victoria continued. They owe money to some very unforgiving people. Your financial advice helped them restructure their assets to pay those debts without triggering money laundering alerts. The Chen family's offshore accounts? You helped them move funds that originated from some questionable import-export businesses. She opened another folder, revealing transaction records that showed exactly how my legitimate consulting work had been facilitating illegal operations. Every success story I'd celebrated, every client relationship I'd built, had been orchestrated to serve Victoria's criminal network. But here's the beautiful part, Victoria said, leaning back in Richard's chair. You did it all so efficiently, so professionally, that our clients want to expand their relationship with Ashworth Strategic. They're offering us a partnership that would make your current income look like pocket change. The room felt like it was shrinking. Magnus was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read: shock, admiration, or horror. Victoria was watching me with the satisfied look of someone who just played their winning card. What happens if I refuse? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Well, the authorities might find it interesting that a consulting firm managed to launder $12 million over 18 months without noticing any irregularities, particularly when that firm kept such detailed records of every transaction. It was blackmail dressed up as a business proposition. Victoria had maneuvered me into a position where I was already compromised, already legally vulnerable, already in too deep to escape without consequences. But as I sat there, feeling the walls close in around me, something else began to emerge alongside the fear and anger, a grudging respect for the complexity of Victoria's manipulation. She hadn't just recruited me, she'd created conditions where I'd recruit myself, making choices that seemed smart and independent while actually serving her agenda perfectly. The partnership would make us equals, Victoria continued. Full transparency about all operations, shared decision-making, and your choice of which clients to work with. Think of it as a promotion rather than an ultimatum. Magnus finally found his voice. Seraphine, you don't have to do this. We could leave Vancouver, start over somewhere else. Victoria's laugh was genuinely amused. Magnus, darling, your wife just discovered she has a talent for high-stakes financial manipulation. Why would she want to go back to saving failing pizzerias when she could be running operations worth millions? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Magnus slept beside me, trying to process the complete reconstruction of my reality. For 3 years, I'd congratulated myself on being the smartest person in the room, the one playing chess while everyone else played checkers. Now I realized I'd been a pawn in a much larger game, moved around the board by someone who'd been planning this outcome since the day Magnus first brought me home for dinner. But what bothered me most wasn't the manipulation. It was how perfectly Victoria had read my personality. She'd known I would be drawn to the challenge, intrigued by the complexity, seduced by the scale of the operation. She'd presented the criminal partnership not as a threat, but as recognition of my abilities. The next morning, I drove to Ashworth Strategic's offices and spread out every contract, every client file, every transaction record from the past 3 years. I needed to understand exactly how deep my involvement went and what options remained available. What I discovered was both worse and better than I'd feared. Worse because Victoria was right. I'd been facilitating money laundering on a massive scale, creating a paper trail that would be difficult to explain away. Better because I'd been so thorough in my documentation that I understood the entire network's structure better than anyone except Victoria herself. The foundations weren't just fronts, they were sophisticated. Financial instruments that moved money through legitimate charitable activities, making illegal funds virtually untraceable. My consulting work had optimized these operations, making them more efficient and less detectable than they'd ever been before. By noon, I'd identified every client who was connected to Victoria's criminal network, traced every questionable transaction, and mapped out the complete money laundering operation. I had enough evidence to bring down the entire network, including myself. But I also had something else, complete understanding of how the system worked. And if I understood the system, I could control it. I called Victoria that afternoon and requested a meeting. Just the two of us. We met at the Fairmont Hotel's tea service, the same location where I'd first accidentally encountered Magnus 3 years earlier. Victoria arrived precisely on time, dressed in understated elegance that somehow managed to look more expensive than obvious designer pieces. "I've been thinking about your offer," I said once we'd settled into our usual performance of polite conversation. "And what conclusions have you reached? I want equal partnership, as you suggested. But I also want to understand why you chose me specifically. There are dozens of financial consultants in Vancouver. Why go to such elaborate lengths to recruit someone who wasn't already criminal?" Victoria smiled, and for the first time it looked genuinely warm. "Because criminals think like criminals. They're predictable, limited by their own moral flexibility. You, however, think like a strategist. You solve problems efficiently and completely, without getting distracted by unnecessary risks or personal drama." She paused, adding sugar to her tea with precise movements. "Also, you were already building the exact network we needed. Your social climbing brought you into contact with all the right families. Your consulting work gave you access to their financial structures. And your ambition ensured you'd document everything thoroughly. So the marriage to Magnus, the family dinners, the foundation contracts, all of that was orchestrated? Guided, not orchestrated. I simply created opportunities and watched you make choices that served both your goals and mine. The beautiful part is that everything you accomplished was genuine. Your business success, your social position, your professional reputation, none of that was fake. I realized then that Victoria hadn't just been manipulating me. She'd been preparing me, training me, positioning me to become her successor in a criminal enterprise that spanned decades and multiple countries. But sitting there in that elegant hotel dining room, something else occurred to me. If Victoria could manipulate the system so completely, what was stopping someone with my skills and knowledge from doing the same thing to her? The partnership officially began the following Monday, and I discovered that Victoria's criminal operation was even more sophisticated than she'd initially revealed. We weren't just laundering money for wealthy families with gambling debts and tax problems. We were facilitating transactions for international clients who moved hundreds of millions through Vancouver's real estate market. But as I settled into my new role, something began bothering me about the entire arrangement. Victoria kept emphasizing how impressed she was with my natural talent for financial manipulation, how perfectly suited I was for high-stakes criminal work, how much our clients appreciated my efficient approach. It took me 3 weeks to realize what was really happening. Every compliment, every expression of admiration, every comment about my abilities was carefully designed to make me feel proud of skills that society would label criminal. Victoria wasn't just using my talents, she was reframing them, making me see criminal behavior as sophisticated business strategy. During our weekly planning meetings, she'd say things like, "You have such an elegant approach to complex financial structures," when discussing money laundering schemes, or "Your attention to detail is remarkable," when reviewing forged documents. She was systematically rewiring my moral framework, making me associate criminal activity with professional excellence. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Ophelia, who mentioned something that stopped me cold. "It's so inspiring to see you and Mom working together. She always said the family business needed someone with your particular combination of intelligence and ambition." "She always said?" I repeated. "How long has she been talking about me joining the family business?" "Oh, since before you and Magnus got engaged. She used to say you were exactly the kind of person who could take the company to the next level, but that you needed time to develop the right perspective first." I excused myself and spent the rest of that evening reconstructing the timeline of my relationship with the Blackthorn family. Every major decision I'd made, every business opportunity that had presented itself, every social connection that had advanced my career, all of it could be traced back to subtle influences from Victoria. She hadn't discovered my talent and decided to recruit me. She'd identified my potential years earlier and systematically created conditions that would develop me into the exact type of person she needed for her organization. But the most unsettling realization was how perfectly her strategy had worked. I had become someone who could rationalize criminal behavior as sophisticated business strategy, who could see money laundering as elegant problem-solving, who could view manipulation as natural talent. Victoria hadn't just recruited me into her criminal organization. She'd transformed me into someone who belonged there. That night, I stood in my home office looking at 3 years of files that documented my evolution from legitimate consultant to criminal facilitator. Every success I'd celebrated, every professional milestone I'd achieved, had been guided by someone who was molding me into her criminal successor. The woman who'd spent years feeling proud of her strategic manipulation had herself been strategically manipulated by someone operating at a completely different level. But here's what Victoria hadn't anticipated. Understanding her methods meant I could reverse engineer them. And if I could see how she'd manipulated me, I could figure out how to manipulate her. The question was whether I wanted to escape her web or take it over entirely. Because looking at the scope of the operation, the international connections, the sophisticated financial structures, I realized something that would have horrified the woman I'd been 3 years earlier. This wasn't just criminal activity. This was power on a scale I'd never imagined possible. And Victoria was right about one thing. I did have a natural talent for it. But did that make me a criminal, or just someone who'd finally found a game worth playing? The answer came to me during a meeting with our most important international client, a Russian oligarch named Dmitry Volkov, who needed to move $60 million through Vancouver's real estate market without triggering money laundering alerts. Victoria had arranged the meeting at a private dining room in the Four Seasons, the kind of location where powerful people conducted business that would never appear in any official records. Dmitry arrived with 2 associates who said nothing, but whose presence suggested this wasn't the type of client who accepted no as an answer. As Victoria explained our services, I watched Dmitry's reaction carefully. He was impressed by our setup, intrigued by our success rate, but completely dismissive of the 2 women presenting to him. Every question was directed to Victoria as if I wasn't present. Every concern was addressed to the ladies with barely concealed condescension. "This is acceptable arrangement," he finally said in heavily accented English. "But I work only with serious people. Not housewives playing business games." Victoria's smile never wavered, but I saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Volkov, I assure you that both Ms. Ashworth and I are completely serious about our professional commitments." "Perhaps," he said, dismissing her with a wave. "But women, they are emotional, unpredictable. This business requires cold thinking, yes? Mathematical precision, not feelings." That's when it hit me like a physical blow. This man, this criminal who needed our help to launder money, who couldn't operate his illegal business without our expertise, was questioning our competence because we were women. Every success I'd achieved, every sophisticated strategy I'd developed, every complex financial structure I'd designed was being dismissed because of my gender. Not because I lacked ability, but because men like Dmitri couldn't conceive of women possessing the intelligence and ruthlessness required for high-stakes criminal activity. Victoria handled the meeting professionally, ultimately securing Dmitri's business through a combination of detailed documentation and reduced fees. But driving home afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about his casual dismissal of our capabilities. "Does this happen often?" I asked Victoria as we sat in traffic on Granville Bridge. "More than you'd imagine," she said quietly. "Richard used to handle all client meetings for exactly this reason. Many of our international contacts simply won't take women seriously, regardless of our track record. So you built a $50 million criminal organization and still have to prove yourself to every new client? Welcome to operating while female in any male-dominated industry, even criminal ones." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about every business meeting I'd attended where men had questioned my expertise, every social gathering where my professional accomplishments had been attributed to luck or male assistance, every time someone had assumed I was Magnus's secretary, rather than a business owner. But what bothered me most was realizing that even in criminal activity, even when I was demonstrably more skilled than most of the men involved, I was still fighting the same battles for recognition and respect. Victoria had manipulated me into criminal activity, yes, but she'd also provided me with an opportunity to operate at a level where gender-based discrimination should have been irrelevant. If you could move money efficiently and avoid detection, what did it matter whether you were male or female? Yet even here, in a world where competence was supposedly the only metric that mattered, I was still being judged by irrelevant biological characteristics. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just at Dmitri, but at every system that had required me to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Every social structure that had made me feel grateful for opportunities I'd actually earned through superior performance. Victoria hadn't just recruited me into criminal activity. She'd given me access to a world where my intelligence and strategic thinking could operate without the constant need to prove myself worthy of basic respect, and now I was questioning whether that made her my manipulator or my liberator, because looking at the scope of what we'd accomplished together, the international network we'd built, the sophisticated operations we managed daily, I realized something that would have shocked the naive woman who'd married Magnus 3 years earlier. Maybe the criminal part wasn't what bothered me about this situation. Maybe what bothered me was discovering that even criminality couldn't escape the limitations that society placed on female ambition. 6 months later, I stood in Victoria's study, my study now, reviewing quarterly reports that showed our operation had grown to process over $80 million annually. Victoria had stepped back into a consulting role, claiming she wanted to enjoy her retirement while watching me take the organization to new levels. But I knew the real reason for her transition. The Dmitri Volkov meeting had been a test, not just of my technical abilities, but of my psychological readiness to fully embrace this world. Victoria had been waiting to see whether I would internalize the gender-based discrimination as a limitation or recognize it as motivation to completely dominate an industry that underestimated women. I chose domination. Our Client roster now included politicians, tech entrepreneurs, real estate developers, and entertainment industry figures who needed sophisticated financial services that traditional banks couldn't provide. The beautiful irony was that most of them requested to work with me specifically. Having heard about the brilliant woman who could solve any financial problem discreetly, Magnus adjusted to our new reality better than I'd expected. He'd always been proud of my professional success, and discovering that my success operated on an international scale only amplified that pride. He particularly enjoyed the social cachet that came with being married to someone who commanded respect from some of the most powerful people in Vancouver. The foundations continued, operating as legitimate charities while providing cover for our more questionable activities. I'd optimized their operations so efficiently that they were actually generating positive social impact while laundering money, creating a sustainable model that served multiple purposes simultaneously. But the most satisfying aspect of the whole arrangement was watching how our success challenged assumptions about female capabilities in high-stakes environments. Every new client who arrived expecting to find some male criminal mastermind instead encountered two women who understood complex financial structures better than most investment bankers. Dmitry Volkov, incidentally, became one of our most enthusiastic advocates after we successfully moved his $60 million without generating a single regulatory inquiry. He now refers other clients to us specifically because of our gender. Having discovered that women attracted less attention from law enforcement agencies that profiled criminal activity based on outdated masculine stereotypes. Last week, I received a call from a journalist writing an article about successful female entrepreneurs in Vancouver. She wanted to interview me about building a consulting firm that served high-net-worth international clients. I politely declined, explaining that our clients valued discretion above publicity. But sitting in my office afterward, I reflected on how different that conversation might have been if she'd understood the complete scope of what we'd accomplished. Here was a woman celebrating female business, success without realizing she was talking to someone who'd revolutionized an entire criminal industry through superior strategic thinking and operational excellence. The organization that Victoria had built over decades, I'd expanded and modernized in less than 2 years. Not through masculine aggression or intimidation, but through the same analytical skills and systematic approach that had made me successful in legitimate consulting. Today, I manage financial structures that most people couldn't comprehend, coordinate operations across multiple countries, and command respect from clients who control billions of dollars. The shy woman who'd felt grateful for a chair at Magnus's family dinner table now controls resources that dwarf the Blackthorne family's traditional investments. Victoria was right about my natural talent for this work, but what she didn't anticipate was that once I understood the full scope of the opportunity, I wouldn't be content to remain her successor. I'd become her superior. The housekeeper badge from that original story was meant to put someone in their place. In my case, it succeeded perfectly. My place wasn't serving dinner at someone else's table. My place was building my own table, setting my own rules, and deciding who deserved a seat. The woman they tried to diminish became the woman who now controls systems they couldn't imagine. And the best part? I did it all while maintaining the perfect image of a successful, respectable businesswoman who just happened to marry well. Some people see gender discrimination as a limitation. I learned to see it as competitive advantage in an industry where being underestimated means operating with perfect camouflage. Look, if you're still listening to this, you probably understand the game better than most people. Subscribe to hear more confessions from people who played at levels society doesn't want to admit exist. Hit that notification bell because these stories don't stay hidden forever. And honestly, I'm curious what you think. Was I manipulated into this life, or did I choose it? The woman they tried to diminish became the woman who now controls systems they couldn't imagine. And the question I'll let you wrestle with, maybe that was the plan all along.